It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
My fellow New York Metropolitan baseball fans, welcome in to another edition of Rico Brogna. It's funny, the offseason has started. The Mets have made minor moves. We've got some new free agents to discuss on this podcast, but we're all waiting. We're all sitting here as Met fans and obviously baseball fans all around the country. We're waiting for the big shoes to drop. So while there's a lot of little things going on here in the early days of this MLB offseason, and there's a lot of things to analyze and debate and different options to go through, we're waiting for the big one. We're all waiting for the big one. It will start with Juan Soto, but that's not all. Then there's Pete Alonso. Then there's Alex Bregman. Then there's Corbin Burns. A lot of big free agents will start to fall relatively soon. But there is still a lot of interesting things going on this Friday night, Saturday morning, depending on when you're listening, downloading, subscribing, Rico Brogna edition of Rico Brogna. We will go through the non-tenders. Friday night at 8 o'clock was the non-tender deadline. So it's a decision that teams have to make about guys on their roster, on their 40-man roster, who are not yet eligible for free agency, who you can decide to tender contract to and bring them back, usually for $4, $5, $6 million, depending on the player. Or if you don't believe in the player anymore, or you're cheap and you don't want to pay said player, you can non-tender them, and that would make them free agents. So there's a few intriguing names we will discuss. We'll also talk about some of the minor moves the Mets have made over the last couple of days, and we'll open up the emails. And there are a lot of emails, a lot of them about Juan Soto, a lot of them about different relievers they should target based on the latest Rico Brogna we did, where we analyzed the reliever market. So there's a lot to discuss on this, Rico. Pete Hoffman is with us. Pete, would you like to make your public apology now to the audience for your disgusting sounds that came out of you during the awards edition of the Rico Brogna?
Yes, I just to everybody out there, to the loyal Rico Brogna fans, to the people that aren't loyal and just happen to casually listen to me snorting like a hog, I apologize for absolutely nothing, and thank you for listening.
Well, he promises he will not make weird noises ever again. All right, so at least you know that. But it's funny, I said this on the last Rico. We get a lot of emails at thericob@gmail.com. I don't think there's anything we've ever said or done on this podcast that has got more feedback than apparently the weird sounds Pete Hoffman made a week ago on the awards edition of the Rico Brogna. So,
and listen, I do mean this wholeheartedly. We didn't know. None of us knew. And I thought I was doing a good job of muting myself. I don't know what happened. So that I am apologetic about. I'm not apologetic for me sniffing. I did have a cold.
Hey, listen, we all have colds. I mean, haven't we all battled it over the last couple of weeks, last couple of months? Let's get down to business. The Mets made a handful of minor moves. They brought in Joey Meneses. Remember Joey Meneses, the former Washington National, the right-hand hitting first baseman who 2 years ago, after the Nationals basically sold everybody off. Meneses was one of those guys they gave an opportunity to and looked like he was proving to be a legitimate major league right-hand hitter. But really last year, he came crashing down to earth. So Meneses, again, is a depth guy, right-handed bat, potentially off the bench, can play first base, can DH. He gets an invitation to spring training. Jackson Reitz, a catcher who has some limited major league experience. I saw a clip of him the other day hitting a home run at the major league level. So Jackson Reitz is a catcher, another depth guy, especially if guys get hurt. And Hobie Harris, a relief pitcher who it was discouraging. It's always discouraging when you sign a relief pitcher, you look at their numbers, and you're hoping that you're going to see something promising. And in Hobie Harris's case, in AAA last year, he pitched to a 6.79 ERA. But you never know. You get Hobie Harris in the pitching lab, and maybe on the June 15th edition of the Rico Brogna, we're talking about what a great find by David Stearns. You know why I'm very careful when the Mets make additions like this? And they've made a few here throughout this offseason, the early part of the offseason. bringing in random guys who you'll see in spring training who, let's be honest, we don't know much about. We go on Baseball Reference to find out more. I always think now of Jose Iglesias. Now, granted, Jose Iglesias was a proven major leaguer when the Mets signed him, but there wasn't an expectation he was going to be on the team. There wasn't an expectation he was going to make an impact. So what I'm always thinking about, what I'm dreaming about, is that when the Mets make one of these random signings, whether it was Chris Davinsky a couple weeks ago, a reliever who has had some success at the major league level, granted it's been a few years, you just hope, at least I do, that as we passingly mention this guy's name, we're going to actually get a major impact from this guy. But for the most part, when you fill in and you sign these guys to minor league deals with spring training invites, you're filling it out for that March roster. These are the guys that are going to get a bunch of at-bats in games where we ask ourselves, why are we still watching the spring training game on March 12th? And now all the regulars are out, and here's Joey Meneses getting a couple at-bats. But you never know. You truly never know. Speaking of spring training invites, Yoenis Cespedes tweeted out the other day, I think it was on Instagram actually, that he wants to make a comeback. And I made this comment while I was on the air with Tiki, and I really believe this. When it comes to spring training invites, I'd hand it out to anybody. So while I'm not a believer that Yoenis Cespedes by any stretch can come back and contribute for the Mets, same thing with Big Bart. Same thing with Bartolo Colon. You want to make a comeback? Here's how you make a comeback. You have a spring training invite. We'll see how you look. Maybe you get some at-bats, or in Colon's case, maybe you throw a few innings, and we go from there. The odds are it will be nothing, but I'm never against the spring training invite. In fact, I remember as a kid, Howard Johnson, the great Hojo that we all loved, came back years after it was over with a spring training invite with the hope of, can Howard Johnson make the team? And I'm trying to remember the exact year it was, but it was certainly after his major league career was basically over, but he was trying to make a comeback. And I thought it was cool when Hojo would get those at-bats in spring training, but it obviously didn't pan out. Armand, another guy who did it, not that he has an affiliation with us, he's not a Met legend or anything like that, was Andres Galarraga. And that must have been, boy, I'm going to say like 2000 or something like that, where Andres Galarraga, you know what? I think it was much later than that now that I think about it, because I somehow have this feeling that Omar Minaya was inviting him. But again, it was after his career was over. Yeah, it had to be later because Andres Galarraga's major league career ended in 2004. So this was probably an 05-06 spring training invite. And I thought it was weird seeing Andres Galarraga in spring training at 44 years old or whatever it was. But not against the spring training invite. Just have limited expectations. You want to see Yoenis Cespedes back off? Does that get you all excited? Does that get you all choked up? No pun intended.
We still paying him?
Luckily, no. I think the bill finally ended. Remember when he walked out of the team in 2020? He actually played during the pandemic for like 5 minutes, sucked, and then said, I'm out of here. I'm just leaving.
Yeah, listen, I do remember that, and that was typical Cespedes, though. I mean, he didn't seem like he was interested in playing ball after a while. My biggest thing is, though, I don't really care about this invite. I don't want to see him. There's nothing left to think. I'd almost prefer to see Daniel Murphy come back. I mean, I think at least that guy can make contact. Cespedes just wants to make money. And I get it. They all want to make money, but he's not going to be productive.
No, I understand. I think that there are no expectations of Yoenis Cespedes or Daniel Murphy or any other former Met coming back and contributing. Murphy did come back last year. Unfortunately, he never made it fully back. As far as non-tenders, the Mets had 3 guys that they non-tendered. One was a surprise to me. Grant Hartwig being non-tendered, and Alex Young, who we talked about the other day when we were going through the reliever free agency edition of the Rico. Like, non-tendering Alex Young is not a surprise. Non-tendering Grant Hartwig is not really a surprise. I was surprised about Alex Ramirez. I mean, Alex Ramirez was a prospect, was a legitimate prospect, and is still very young. But he was on the 40-man roster, which I think has a lot to do with it. They're clearing room off the 40-man roster. So there's always a chance you can bring Alex Ramirez back. I mean, it's not that he's definitely away from this organization. But even when realizing he had underachieved and has not put together the hype that he had as a big prospect, I didn't think of him as a non-tender candidate. I didn't think necessarily the Mets were just going to move on from him, but they did. So I was a little surprised by that. He is still only 21. He'll be 22 in January. So we're still talking about a guy who is very young. He was a top 100 prospect going into 2023. So not that far removed from being a pretty good prospect. But you look at his numbers last year, he was terrible. He was at AA Binghamton, hit 210 with 5 home runs, 46 RBIs, did steal 40 bases. So there's that, but had a just horrific 590 OPS. So he's young, and he's not that far removed from being a relatively decent prospect. But obviously, you can see the flower has come off the rose, or the rose has come off the flower. I don't know. Sometimes I have a tough time remembering these analogies, but I have an even more difficult time when we do late night Ricos because my brain doesn't function that well. So those are the 3 guys they non-tendered. As far as who they did tender, Paul Blackburn, I thought was a candidate to be non-tendered. We talked about this briefly when we did the starting pitching free agent Rico and went through the Mets' current starting pitching options. Paul Blackburn is going to be tendered a contract. Now, there are 2 things you got to keep in mind about Paul Blackburn. It is possible the Mets trade him. Just because you tender a guy a contract doesn't mean they're going to be on the roster when this season starts. So Paul Blackburn can very well be traded away. I doubt he would be released because I think his salary will probably end up at about $5 or $6 million. But I think Paul Blackburn can be useful. Now, one of the critiques of him is that he hasn't pitched a lot. He's had a very difficult time staying healthy. We saw that with the Mets. He only made 5 starts. His first one was very good. Remember, he made that out in Anaheim at the beginning of that West Coast trip, had a couple of duds mixed in there, but he only made 5 starts. And, honestly, looking back at the way this season ended, not that Paul Blackburn was ever going to make a postseason start, but could they have used him out of the bullpen? Sure, why not? They could have used that arm. So I think the way I view Blackburn right now, assuming the Mets don't trade him, is he fits that swing guy kind of role. I would not be happy if the Mets go into the start of next season with Paul Blackburn as their 5th starter. But if you're telling me he's in that swing spot where potentially he's a long man out of the bullpen, now he hasn't made a lot of bullpen appearances in his career. In fact, he's only made 4. He's been really just a starting pitcher, but he doesn't pitch a lot. He's very tough to rely on. Some of it has been just incredibly unlucky, obviously, but I would look at him more as a swing guy than anything. Paul Blackburn being the 5th starter, I don't love. I guess the only way I'd feel better about it is if, let's say, the 2 starters you add are top-line starters. You already have Kodai Senga. You already have David Peterson. If you're telling me, and I don't know if the Mets are going to do this, it's kind of the guessing game on the finances and how much they're willing to spend. But let's say they sign Max Fried and Corbin Burns. I doubt that. But again, they do that. Then I think you're looking at the 5th starter saying, all right, fine. If it's Paul Blackburn, if it's Tyler McGill, if it's, maybe one of the younger guys stepping up and taking the job, fine. But Paul Blackburn was tendered a contract. He only made 5 starts for the Mets last year. He made 9 starts in Oakland. Career ERA of 4.85. But here's the thing, man. You just look at the amount of starts he's made over the years. He's unreliable. He made 1 start in 2020, 9 in 2021, made 21 in 2022. That was the year he was the All-Star. Made 20 in 2023, and then last year combined between Oakland and the Mets, he made 14 starts. So he was tendered a contract. As far as the guys around the league that jump out at me in terms of being non-tendered, the number one guy that jumped out at me was Jordan Romano. Jordan is 31 years old. He's going to be 32 in April, so still relatively young. He had an absolutely lost season last year for the Blue Jays. He ended up having a right elbow injury numerous times and eventually had arthroscopic surgery. So last year was a complete lost year. And I think what the Blue Jays are doing here is they're basically saying we don't want to pay him. Jordan Romano was probably going to get, I think, about $7 or $8 million as he's very close to free agency, or was it going to be close to free agency? He only had 1 more year left of arbitration, and last year made $7.7 million. The way this system works, such a weird system. Even though he had a lost year, even though he had a terrible year, barely pitched, he wasn't going to have some kind of pay cut. So the Blue Jays made a financial decision. By the way, let me say this about the Blue Jays, and I hope that Juan Soto is watching this. Juan, you want to win. You want a team to spend. And I'm not trying to put Jordan Romano in the Hall of Fame But the guy made back-to-back All-Star teams and was the Blue Jay closer last year or 2 years ago. He had back-to-back 30-plus save seasons. He had one bad year, 1 year in which he wasn't healthy. And the Blue Jays are making a cost-cutting move? So look, I'm not saying that's going to determine Juan Soto going to Toronto or not, but that's a cost-cutting move. Like, I can tell you right now, if Jordan Romano was ours and was a dominant reliever 3 consecutive years, and he was. That's what Jordan Romano was. He was a very good reliever or a dominant reliever for parts of 3 seasons, and he has one bad year, and he's still relatively young, and you non-tender him because you just don't want to spend the money when relievers are so up and down every year, I don't know, man. I'd be pissed off. I wouldn't like that. And so because of that, that's why it jumped out at me. Think about this with Jordan Romano. So last year, he has the injury, has the elbow issue, and obviously you want to have that checked out. You want to give him an MRI, or not an MRI, but you want to give him a physical, and hopefully this isn't some kind of long-term injury. Now, I guess you could argue the Blue Jays have the medicals. Maybe they know better. I doubt they know better. I think this is just literally, we don't want to pay this guy a certain amount of money. But last year, and by last year, I mean 2023, not 2024, he saved 36 games. He struck out 11 guys per 9 innings. He had a 2.9 ERA. His whip was relatively high. I'll give you that. But he went out and he saved 36 games, pitched 59 innings. The year before that with the Blue Jays, he pitched to a microscopic 2.11 ERA, in which his whip was much lower than it was last year. And again, saved 36 games and made 63 appearances. The year before that, he had a 2.14 ERA, struck out 12.1 guys per 9 innings. In fact, over that 3-year run he had with Toronto where he made 62, 63, 59 appearances, he was striking out between 11 and 12 guys per 9 innings, and his walks remained around the same in the 3s per 9 innings. 2.14, 2.11, 2.90 ERA as one of the better, more reliable closers in Major League Baseball. Last year was a disaster. He only pitched 15 games. He had an ERA of 7. It was abysmal. His strikeouts were down. His walks were actually pretty good, but his strikeouts were down. He was giving up a ton of hits. His FIP backed up that he wasn't pitching in a bad luck. He was atrocious. One bad year. And I would think that Romano in free agency is only going to want a 1-year deal, a make-good 1-year deal, a 1-year contract in which he proves, hey, I'm that guy from 23 and 22. Because if he has a year like 22 or 23, or dare I say he got to free agency after 2023, he's going to get a big contract. He was going to get big-time money. So this one, to me, is absolutely worth the risk. No doubt about it. I get Jordan Romano on a 1-year, let's just say what the Blue Jays had to pay him, but they didn't want to. $8.5, $9 million. I'd do that in a second. And that's the non-tender that jumped out at me. Jordan Romano. We talked about relievers a few days ago on the Rico. If you missed it, download it, subscribe. Did a whole breakdown of every freaking relief pitcher that was out there. Jordan Romano would have been, certainly not at the top of the list, but he would have been towards the top. I love guys off bad years. I mean, call me crazy, because you're paying for the fact that he is coming off a bad year, or at least he's paying for that, and you're going to get him on a short-term deal. Look, the last thing I want to do, I know you have to do it. Like if you want to sign Tanner Scott, as we talked about, you're going to have to give him a contract that gives you a stomachache. You just are. You're going to have to give him a 4-year contract. I don't want to give any reliever a 4-year contract unless they're Edwin Diaz. And even Edwin Diaz, do we feel awesome about a long-term contract? So at 31, he'll be 32 in April. 1 down year, but before that, 3 really good years in a row. That would be a very good addition to my bullpen. I would be excited, and I would be aggressive going after Jordan Romano. The other guy that got non-tendered, by the way, what's your thoughts about that? Are you with me on a Romano? You like that move?
I'm okay with Romano, and I do agree that the every other year stuff with bullpen guys, so to have a bad year to get them cheap means it's bounce back years coming up. So I'm excited about that. I do, but dude, you only have 2 guys that stick out to you, because I'm gonna have more.
You're talking about non-tenders?
Yeah.
There's two guys that intrigue me. Yes, if you've got a lot more, we'll go through them, and I'll probably tell you why they don't intrigue me, and then the audience can decide. Are they intrigued or are they unintrigued? But there are a lot of names of non-tenders, so we'll go through all of them. But the other guy, not as exciting as Jordan Romano, I admit, is Kyle Finnegan. Kyle Finnegan got non-tendered by the Nationals, and I admit I was very surprised by this because Kyle Finnegan has been very consistent for the last 4 years. Unlike Romano, who's coming off that bad year in which he barely pitched, here are the numbers about Kyle Finnegan that I like, and then we'll go through why he's probably a little overrated. Kyle Finnegan, 4 consecutive years. This goes back to 2021, his first full season in the major leagues. 68 appearances, 66 innings in 21. In 2022, 66 appearances, 66 and 2/3 innings. 2023, 67 appearances, 69 and a third innings. And then last year, 2024, he was an all-star. 65 appearances, 63 and 2/3 innings. Just a model of consistency. And if you look at his ERA, if you want to look at his FIP, if you want to look at his WHIP, whatever you want to look at, the last 4 years are almost identical. Now, they're not dominant numbers. They're not all-star numbers, despite him being an all-star last year. I think the only reason he was a closer is because it was the Nationals. I think if you put him on a good team, he's probably not a closer. But his ERAs over the last 4 years, 3.55, 3.51, 3.76, 3.68. His FIP, and the reason I look at FIP is it's a way to kind of see, none of these stats are perfect. It's a way to see, was he lucky? And with relievers, I look at it a lot more because, look, you could have one bad performance or you could just have a lot of bad luck and your ERA can kind of get out of whack. So I don't want to just look at that one stat. That's why I look at FIP. Kind of gives you a better idea of, hey, how lucky was he? But his FIP basically tells you 4.52, 3.76, 4.58, 4.25. So he's mostly a little bit lucky, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he's not a huge strikeout guy. His strikeout numbers, 9.3, 9.5, 8.2, 8.5. But you see very consistent. His walk numbers, 3.0, 3.1, 3.4. Very, very just, he's the same guy. And to me, that guy I described, that's not an all-star. That's not a top-end reliever. That's just a solid reliever. And that's okay. You're going to need 8 guys in your bullpen. So if you're telling me I got a guy in Finnegan who I can write down for 65, 70 appearances. Remember, the Mets had nobody make those amounts of appearances last year. Not one person. The most relief appearances was what, 54, 55 by Reed Garrett? So I am intrigued by the consistency. He is a little overrated. He's not a closer, even though he was a closer last year for the Nationals. But I would like him as just a reliable bullpen arm, and you could always use a reliable bullpen arm. You intrigued by Kyle Finnegan, Hoff? Hold on. Let me do my Hoff imitation.
No, I'm here. I'm sorry. I was going over other non-tenders. Yes, I actually love Kyle Finnegan. I do think that he's someone that the Mets should definitely look into.
Thank you very much. I will name you other guys who are non-tendered, and then you tell me when you're intrigued. Fair enough?
Yes.
All right.
Sounds good.
The Oakland A's non-tendered Danny Jimenez. He's a crappy reliever. There's no way you're intrigued by him. The Atlanta Braves had 3 non-tenders. Huascar Ynoa, Ramon Laureano, an outfielder, and Griffin Canning. Griffin Canning is actually the guy that they acquired for Jorge Soler, which shows you that was just purely a let's dump the contract move. Are you intrigued by any of those 3 Atlanta Braves?
No.
The Orioles non-tendered reliever Jacob Webb. The Chicago Cubs non-tendered Mike Tauchman, the sock man, and Nick Madrigal. You intrigued by Mike Tauchman? Is that what you're telling me, Pete?
No, I thought they tendered 2 more guys.
Who else? Who else did they non-tender that jumped out at you?
2 guys. Patrick Wisdom, and I know that he had a terrible year last year, but prior to that, each year he had 20-plus home runs, just another power bat. maybe something like off the bench type of thing. Somebody you could give him a decent invite to spring training, maybe see what he's got left to take. And then also their former closer at one point in time who didn't last very long over there, but Adbert Alzolay, if I'm correct, he got non-tendered. Last year was miserable. Don't get me wrong, but the year before that, he was lights out. He's one of the better pitchers in the league, if I'm correct. I would definitely take a risk on him, seeing what he's got in the tank.
Yeah, both of those guys were, you're right, they're both available. They were both DFA'd in the last couple of days. So not exactly a non-tender, but basically the same thing. They're both available. So you are correct. I'm not intrigued by either, but there you go.
Yay.
But I appreciate it. Let's see who else. The Chicago White Sox non-tendered Eniel De Los Santos and Gavin Sheets.
No.
The Cincinnati Reds non-tendered Ian Jabba, I think is how you pronounce it. Very, very French. Jabba. The Rockies non-tendered Brendan Rodgers, the infielder, and Cal Quantrill, who I'm not really intrigued by Cal Quantrill, but that's another depth guy, depth option. Who else got non-tendered? Let's see. The Angels non-tendered Patrick Sandoval. That's one of the bigger names. Just so we know the deal with Sandoval, he's only 27 years old. He's a lefty, so those two things are great. He had Tommy John surgery. So Sandoval is likely not pitching in 2025. So if you sign Sandoval, you're doing it as a project. You're doing it as a, hey, let's sign him to a 2-year deal. We're going to rehab the guy. He's still really young, so there's a lot of potential, especially if you get your hands on him and you like, his stuff and you like his potential. But that's not something that's really going to help you in 2025. He had the Tommy John surgery, had a brace on the elbow. I think it's like a newer form of Tommy John surgery. I think it's similar to what Christian Scott just had, but it's going to wipe him out for probably most of 2025. So that's a project signing if you're interested.
No, not interested.
The Milwaukee Brewers non-tendered Hobie Milner. So Hobie Milner is the lefty, kind of like a side-arming left-hander. Here's what's weird about Hobie Milner, because, hey, we need a lefty, right? We could certainly use a left-handed reliever. They just got rid of Alex Young. Not that that's the reason they need a lefty reliever. They need a lefty reliever because they really didn't have one last year after Brooks Raley got hurt. Milner's numbers last year were not good. He also had reverse splits. He wasn't getting lefties out. Lefties hit like 270 against him. The year before that, that's the Hobie Milner you want. Had a great year, dominated lefties. But like we said, it's an up-down thing. So you want to bring a guy like Milner in on a very low money deal. Sure, why not? I don't have a lot of faith in him, but he definitely fits the whole up and down reliever market.
Did you miss Detroit?
Say that one more time.
Did you miss Detroit Tigers?
Why? Who'd the Tigers? Maybe I did. Maybe I'm not going in that order.
Well, if you should have been, because what I was expecting, and it's alphabetical, crying out loud.
Oh, have I been going alphabetical? Is that what you noticed?
I'm sorry. I lied. It's not. It's Seattle. So get there first.
Yeah, Detroit actually tendered everybody a contract, is my understanding. So there were no non-tender issues with them. The Yankees actually had a couple of interesting ones. They non-tendered John Birdie, which I was surprised about. Birdie's a useful player, and he's been a Met killer in the past. That's a good little piece off the bench, a guy that could play all over the infield and steal a base. He's a good little player, and we're going to get into this. Our next Rico that we're going to air Sunday night into Monday or whenever you download it is going to be the free agent preview of position players. And I'll lay this out in more detail when we do that pod, but I'll say it now. I'm not really in the market for a lot of bench utility-ish infielders because I think the Mets are covered with that. I really do, especially with all the young players that may get an opportunity to play at the major league level, and the fact that I want Jose Iglesias back, and the fact that maybe Jeff McNeil's on the roster, and the fact that Luis Angel Acuna could kind of serve in a super utility role. So while I think John Birdie's a nice, useful player, I'm not jumping to add a guy like that. And I'll kind of break it down on the roster perspective on why I don't think that's necessary.
Well, you got to get Iglesias back first before you,
of course,
say that Birdie's not. Like, Birdie definitely is a useful player, but again, I think you're correct. You bring in one guy like Iglesias, and if if it's not Iglesias, it's Birdie. There's some other guys that are like that are good role players that could be like a fifth utility guy type of thing.
No doubt. The Phillies non-tendered Austin Hayes, an outfielder. The Pittsburgh Pirates non-tendered Brian De La Cruz, another outfielder, the former Marlin. And they non-tendered Connor Joe. Connor Joe's interesting because he's a right-handed hitter. He could play first base. He can also, I think, play the outfield a little bit.
I think he plays right field.
Yeah, he's an outfield first baseman, a little bit of pop. Useful utility player, like a better version of Joey Meneses, who they just signed to a minor league deal. Padres non-tendered Luis Patino. The Mariners non-tendered Josh Rojas. Is that who is intriguing you? No. Austin Voth. Is that who's intriguing you?
No.
Sean Haggerty. Is that who's intriguing you?
No.
Those are the three guys they non-tendered, so I don't know who's intriguing you.
See, maybe I read the wrong thing, but JT Chargois, did he not get, maybe he got DFA'd?
JT Chargois, I thought he had a good year last year. They got rid of him?
Yes.
All right, let me fact check our man over here. JT Chargois. He was acquired at the trade deadline from the Marlins. Yeah, no, you are right about that. He got non-tendered. Oh, I like that one. That one just came out there. JT Chargois was non-tendered right before the deadline. So the page I'm looking at, not fully updated. That's a good one right there. Let me look at his numbers in depth last year. Yeah, he had a really good year last year. So with the Marlins, he had a 1.62 ERA. It was only 16 2/3 innings. He didn't pitch a lot. And then he gets traded to Seattle, 19 2/3 innings, 2.75 ERA. He is 33, 34 years old. He's going to be 34 next week. So we'll just say he's 34 years old. I think the issue with him is staying healthy. He's not had any full seasons of giving you 60 or 70 appearances, but I'm with you. That's an intriguing option to add to the bullpen, especially with the success that he had last year in Miami and Seattle. So I'll give you that one.
Listen, I got to be honest with you. He'll fit in very well with a bullpen that gets hurt all the time anyway. So it's like, just as long as they don't all get hurt at the same time, we're okay.
That's the key. Dylan Carlson, Tyler Alexander, and Colin Poche got non-tendered. We mentioned Jordan Romano with the Toronto Blue Jays. And the other guy, along with Kyle Finnegan, was Tanner Rainey, another reliever. The relievers are the ones that are probably the most intriguing from this list. And that's not surprising because I think there are a lot of teams that just don't want to pay relievers. And a lot of non-tendering is just not wanting to pay the bill. So Tanner Rainey of the Washington Nationals, the other guy. Yeah, I kind of stick with Jordan Romano, Kyle Finnegan. I'll give you JT Chargois. That's not bad. But it's all relievers. Those are the ones that intrigue me. If you want to bring in, what's his name from Anaheim, Patrick Sandoval, as a kind of rehab project, I'm never against anything like that. As much as we're thinking about just 2025, you're always also thinking about the future. So I wouldn't be against something like that. But those are the names that intrigue me the most from the non-tender deadline that came out today.
Yeah, I think the only other guy that I would really Quintrell. I do feel like if you want to. I trust the pitching lab. I'd call me crazy here. I trust the pitching lab, and maybe you give Cal Quintrell a chance to, because again, be depth guy on the roster. That'd be nice.
All right, let's get to a lot of your emails. We've gotten a ton over the last couple of days, and I always try to at least have one Rico per week where we go deep into these emails. It's about all sorts of subjects around the Mets offseason. So let's go. Let's start off with Zachary Rosen. Zach writes, "Hi, Evan. I've compiled a list of relievers I believe are due for bounce-back years that are most likely available in trade." So these are all trade candidates. Camilo Doval. Camilo Doval had a terrible year last year for the Giants. Walked a ton of guys, had a 4.88 ERA jumping up from 2.93. Pete Fairbanks, another guy. He had some injury problems last year too. And he's also crazy. Have you ever seen Pete Fairbanks in an interview? He's incredibly intense. David Bednar. What happened to David Bednar? In 2023, he had a 2 ERA, was one of the better relievers in baseball. And then in 2024, had a 5.77 ERA. Alexis Diaz, Justin Lawrence, and then Zach writes, as a bonus, how about Ben Joyce? Curious on your thoughts. So would I be interested in Doval off a bounce back year? Sure. I wouldn't want to give up a lot. I think that's the kind of the key when we're talking about trades like this. All right, what am I giving up? Am I giving up a top 100 prospect for Camilo Doval or Pete Fairbanks or David Bednar or Alexis Diaz? Probably not. Ben Joyce, I don't think is available. Ben Joyce is the kid who throws 104 miles an hour. We got a glimpse of him very briefly last year in that Anaheim series. It wouldn't be dumb for the Angels to trade him, but I think if they did trade him, they would be looking for a lot back. And I have a tough time giving up a lot for a reliever. If I'm giving up a lot for a reliever, which the Mets essentially did in the Edwin Diaz trade 6 years ago, I want that guy to be top of the line. Like if I'm giving up a lot for a reliever, yeah, Devin Williams is probably the guy I'm targeting. Brian Safchik writes, Juan Soto, unless Hal Steinbrenner is completely full of it, which is possible, I think it may take a crazy number to scare him away. Say what you want about Brian Cashman, but he's no idiot. He had to have told Hal that it was going to be a minimum of $600 million to sign Soto when they made that trade. And then after the Ohtani signing, coupled with the year Soto just had. I don't see how the Yankees don't know this is now going to be in the $700 million range. Steve Cohen better be ready to make an obscene offer because I think when it's all said and done, the final number for Soto will be a lot higher than any of us expected. And here's Brian's prediction. This is a lot higher than any of us expected. And I thought I was on the high end of Soto contract predictions. 15 years, $825 million. That is $55 million a year. I think that's the AAV he's looking for. Oh my God. Let me get my calculator out on that one. 15 times 55, $825 million a year. I don't think he's going to get that much. Now, I think he's going to get a lot. I think he has a chance to get $50 million a year. I think he's got a chance to get a 15-year contract. I don't know if they would actually be together. You know what I mean? Like, I think if he's getting $50 million, I don't know if a team's going to give him $50 million per over the course of 15 years. I've had it in the sevens, which for some is too high, but that would be nuts. $825 million. I'm not against it. Look, if Steve Cohen's willing to pay it, then I'm certainly, as a fan, willing to say, okay. Christopher writes, I just heard your Bullpen Jose Siri podcast. I wanted to remind David Stearns, and I hope he listens, that the biggest problem with the Mets bullpen and possibly the entire pitching staff last year was walks. It was painful to watch as we constantly put ourselves in jams and had to fight our way back. It's not sustainable. If I'm David Stearns, I'm taking a hard look at 3 key stats this year when signing any pitcher: WHIP, FIP, and walks per 9 innings. There is no doubt when it comes to relievers, when it comes to starters, just really as a whole, they have to cut down on walks. Absolutely, I agree with you. This is from Mick Whitmore concerning relievers. Thanks for the podcast. This will help us get through a long winter. Well, thank you, Mick. We're going to pound them out as much as we can. I agree with your recap of the relievers, except for Clay Holmes. I keep a close eye on the Yankees, too, and it's hard to overlook his league-leading 13 blown saves, some of which were just brutal. He had his worst year as a Yankee last year, trending in the wrong direction for hits and opponent batting average. Let's avoid him. Why are you so enthused about Clay Holmes as a potential Met? I think a part of the reason why I'm intrigued by Clay Holmes is that I think he's just going to pitch better not being in a high-pressurized closer role. I think we saw that once the Yankees pulled him out of that in September. The other thing I like about Clay Holmes, and this shouldn't surprise you based on what I was just saying about Kyle Finnegan, I like reliability. And there isn't a lot of that with relievers. There just isn't. You know, a guy that you can feel good about giving you 60, 65, dare I say 70 appearances and not sucking. And look, I don't think Clay Holmes has sucked. You know, when he got to the Yankees in the middle of the 2021 season, he was great. Like it's almost like he flipped a switch or the Yankees figured something out with Clay after the Pittsburgh trade. He was great. Pitched to a 1.61 ERA and he was awesome. But in 2022, he made 62 appearances. In 2023, he made 66 appearances. This past year, he made 67 appearances. And, you know, if you look at his strikeouts per 9 innings, if you look at his walks, if you look at his FIP, I think this is the same guy who said we should look at that, or maybe that was the previous emailer. They're actually relatively consistent. Relatively consistent. So I don't think last year was this major drop-off. He was an all-star. He pitched with 3.14 ERA. Yes, he blew a lot of games. Yes, we saw a lot of it if you're in New York, but I don't think it was as awful as what you're describing. And look, I think sometimes we have kind of almost a negative bias towards Yankees because we analyze them so closely. If we're talking about Clay Holmes, the Cincinnati Red, who put up the exact same numbers, even with those blown saves, I think you'd feel a little different about it, in my opinion. Daniel Lang writes, the Mets are getting played in the Juan Soto sweepstakes. Evan, Pete, do you guys feel like the Mets and Cohen are getting played by Scott Boras in the Juan Soto sweepstakes? I didn't feel like that. I didn't feel like they were until I heard his mouthpiece, John Heyman, say he believes the Mets have the edge, followed by the Blue Jays. Even though that should sound positive, I take that as him putting out the info to use Cohen's wealth as a weapon to run the price up. I still feel like Steve Cohen will outbid everybody, but I don't know if it will be enough. What do you think of that, Pete?
You know what? I've noticed recently, Heyman obviously said it, but I believe it was Rosenthal and one other person said too that the Mets are the favorite to get the Juan Soto. So is that someone feeding information? Are they just trying to, whatever the case is? I just think that's facts. So I don't think that they're putting I think that sure, they want as much money as possible, but in the end, it doesn't make a difference. The Mets are going to be the favorite to get him because they could outspend everybody.
Yeah, I don't know if they're being used, but what I will tell you I'm concerned about is anytime everyone's pointing to the same team, and anytime you continue to hear the Mets aren't going to get outbid, the Mets are going to get them, it makes me nervous. Now, is that an irrational kind of Met fan view? Maybe. But I'm sure a lot of us feel the same way. Like, the more I hear he's going to be a Met, the more I hear the experts predict the Mets, the more nervous I get. The more I'm thinking, oh, we're going to get slapped in the face. And I don't know if it's that he's being used. Like, that's why I'm not fully agreeing with what he's saying. I don't know if it's that he's being used. Because here's the other thing, and this is going to piss some of my fellow Met fans off, but prove me wrong, is what I would say to Steve Cohen. I don't trust him yet. I don't fully trust that the Mets are making the biggest offer for Juan Soto. I'm demanding that. I think we're all demanding that. The Mets have spent a lot of money, so it's not as if this is like he's cheap, but outbidding everybody on a megastar, we haven't seen that yet. We just haven't. So my trust isn't as full as a lot of my fellow Met fans have for Steve that they're going to make the biggest offer. Right now, it's a lot of hot air. Until they make the biggest offer for Juan Soto, until I see it happen. And it doesn't mean Juan has to pick the Mets. He may not. He may want to go back to the Yankees. That's absolutely on the table. But until they do make the biggest offer, it makes me nervous because I haven't seen it yet. I really haven't.
I mean, can you say that Scherzer and Verlander's contracts, again, short term, but they overpaid for him?
That's why I made it clear. Megastar, like outbidding everyone on a star that everybody wants. Like ultimately with Verlander and Scherzer, there wasn't a robust market for them. Yeah, they offered a lot. I give Steve credit for that. I give Steve credit for the fact that he extended Lindor and the fact the Mets have had a huge payroll. That's why, yes, he's a big market owner. Yes, he has spent a lot of money. This is different. You are looking to outbid the world on the free agent everybody wants. So the more I hear the Mets, the more the pressure gets heated up. Like, I bet they better make the biggest offer. We better hear that story. If Juan Soto stays with the Yankees or goes wherever, we better hear he turned down the biggest offer from the Mets to go to said team. Now, the next thing we may do, because I'll probably do it, is, well, you should have outbid them by more. I said that about Yamamoto, where yeah, they had the highest offer, but it was the highest offer until the Dodgers were able to match it. You know what I mean? So it turned out not to be the highest offer. They allowed the Dodgers in the game to basically match it, call it a day. They got Yamamoto. So I am nervous about this Soto thing. My confidence is not nearly as high as you, Pete, and maybe nearly not as high as John Heyman is.
Well, I'll tell you this much. If the Mets don't offer the most for Juan Soto, I'm definitely going to be texting John Heyman some nasty things.
Well, I'm sure Giant fans do from the Arson Judge days. Deanne writes, I want Soto, and I really don't care what they give him, but I don't understand why Soto is getting $700 million and Ohtani's contract present-day value is at $457 million. The AAV of 50-plus million when Judge only gets $43 million. I understand the length because of his age, but $700 million, 50-plus per year with little to no deferrals seems ridiculous. I like your Walker Buehler call and would be super aggressive with him. I would have no problem rolling the dice on a 4-year, $70 million deal. When he is right, he is elite. Great pod. Well, we appreciate that. I don't know if Walker Buehler would actually agree to that contract. Because I think that Bueller's probably thinking to himself, if I take a 1-year deal or even a 2-3-year deal, but I got the opt-out after the first year, and I put together kind of the years I was having prior to the Tommy John surgery, he's probably thinking, man, I could get $30 million a year and maybe get a 5-year deal. And all of a sudden you're looking at 4 years, 120, something of that nature. So I think that Buehler is probably more likely on a shorter term deal. I don't think you can compare this to Ohtani. It's so different on a lot of levels. His decision to have everything, what's the term I'm looking for when the money gets paid? The deferrals. The decision to defer all that money was just so weird. It was so unorthodox. You know what I mean? Like, it's not normal. And so I wouldn't expect Soto or anyone else to do that. Anyhow, one last one about Juan. Actually, there's a lot more about Juan Soto. We could do like 10 more emails about Juan Soto.
Can I just make a comment about the Ohtani thing?
Yes.
It was left field, came out of left field with the deferrals, but there's only one person in baseball that could do that. Shohei Ohtani, because of how much money he makes outside of baseball. No one else is going to do that for that extent. Well, and on top of that too, dude, I'm telling you right now, baseball's going to find a way to knock that off. Like, you can't ever do that again.
Yeah, well, but not now. I mean, they're going to knock that off in the next CBA, but if a player was willing to accept a similar kind of contract, they're not going to step in now. So you have every right to do it, but I don't guys are making enough money where they can do it if they want to. You're still getting $30 million a year, essentially. Actually, You're not, but the AAV comes out to that. It comes out to like $45 million. But you have enough money where, yes, you can do it, but why would you want to do it? I mean, why? Because you're a nice guy? Because you want to help said team? I think what Ohtani did was very unprecedented, and I don't think we're going to see a lot of teams do it. Now, we've always had deferrals in contracts. If you look at the Nationals are a great example of this. They still owe like 10 different guys money off of deferrals. The Max Scherzer contract is still being deferred. The Strasburg contract is still being deferred. Like, they got so many deferrals, and obviously the Mets have done deferrals, just not to the extent of what we saw with Juan Soto. Jimmy writes, would you give Soto an opt-out? With these reports of the Mets offering potentially $660 million and willing to go over $50 million over the highest bidder, I have some thoughts. Evan, I share your ever-building assertion that Steve Cohen cannot miss on Soto under any circumstances. As you said, show him the money. But taking the reports with a grain of salt, hypothetically, would $50 million above the Yankees bid or any bid even be enough? Assuming it's a 14-year contract, $50 million is only an AAV increase of $3.5 million a year. Is that enough to convince a player to come to the Mets over the Yankees or the Dodgers? It is merely going to take the most money. So, what if Soto were to accept the Mets' offer contingent on an opt-out after the 4th year, allowing him to hit free agency again at 30 years old? Would you still sign him? I do it. I don't see why the Mets wouldn't. If he doesn't live up to the expectations or the market, doesn't adjust, he remains in the contract he wanted. If he opts out, the Mets should still be confident that they wouldn't be outbid unless he wants out of New York because he doesn't like the direction of the team or he likes the school systems in Colorado better. Very nice. Very nice. Oh, and I'd be fiscally responsible in building the rest of the team. Pete stays. He made $20.5 million last year. Bringing him back at $22 to $25 million a year is a wash. Trading for Crochet costs nothing. Picking up Jordan Montgomery from the Diamondbacks via swapping salaries, Marte or McNeil adds nothing. The only guy I'd be willing to pay who's not a free agent is Jacob deGrom. I have opposite feelings on Jake than you do, but if Texas picks up a decent portion of the contract, I'd pay him. I'd pass on Corbin Burns. I'd sign Noah Syndergaard to a minor league deal first. I want pitchers who had Tommy John surgery already. That's why my starter wish list starts with Crochet and Jake, hopefully both, and then add Montgomery and run him through the pitching lab and hope for the best. All right, a lot there. Let me go to the opt-outs. I am not afraid of opt-outs. I don't even think opt-outs are as bad as some people think, because my attitude on the opt-out, and Jimmy did a great job of kind of explaining it, is if you give Soto, let's say it's a 12-year contract and an opt-out after 3 years. So that means he'll play at age 26, 27, 28, and then has a chance to re-enter the market as a 29-year-old, which is when most guys get to free agency, 29, 30. I agree with you that, A, you've got Soto playing for another contract for 3 years. So the assumption is you're only going to get the best of him. And if I'm willing to give him, a 14-year, $700 million contract now, and he gives me 3 great years in 3 years, why wouldn't I be willing to then outbid everybody else again? Like, I'm not afraid of the opt-outs. I think the opt-outs also offer you this. They also offer you, and I know this would be difficult to do, but he has 3 great years, but simultaneously, the Mets are developing this killer farm system. You could walk away from him. You could say, thank you for those 3 years. You gave us a lot. We're good now. We love our system. We're going to reinvest that money in a different way. Is that a likely thing to happen? Probably not, but you do have that ability. The opt-outs are very interesting. I would keep an eye on it. I can't wait to hear more reporting from John Heyman, on if that's something Juan Soto is going to want. But for me, as a Met fan, as someone who wants Juan Soto, opt-outs would not scare me. And I get why you want them if you're Soto. You have the option to opt out at age 29. And maybe you turn that into another massive contract, depending on what the market looks like. You also may look at the market and say, I'm not going to do much better. I've got 10 more years on this contract. I'll just stick with that. We do appreciate all the emails. I apologize we didn't get to all of them, but we will continue to try to do, heavy mailbag editions of the Rico as time goes by. But you can email us at thericob@gmail.com, thericob@gmail.com. Coming up in the Sunday night edition of Rico Brogna, it'll be posted Sunday night. You'll be able to watch it on YouTube Sunday night. Then obviously, maybe you download it Monday morning. We will go in depth on the position player free agent market. We have done starters. We have done relievers. We will now look at the position players. We also have trade week coming up real soon. We will hit the trade targets for starting pitchers, relievers, position players, and even the ever-popular Met Yankee Trade Machine podcast, where we put together, with a guest Yankee fan, a bunch of fake Met Yankee trades that actually make sense, that probably never happen, but boy, they make sense. So a lot to look forward to as we continue to try to give you a lot of Met content during this offseason with the Rico Brogna. Please download, subscribe, rate the podcast whenever you can, and thank you very much for listening to another edition of Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.